August 1959. Audrey Hepburn was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles at 3 a.m., bleeding heavily and in severe pain. She was 30 years old, 4 months pregnant, and terrified. By 6 a.m., the baby was gone. Her third miscarriage. But here's what the hospital records don't show. When the doctors told Audrey she'd lost another baby, her husband, Mel Ferrer, wasn't there. He was at home, asleep. He didn't arrive at the hospital until noon, 8 hours after his wife had been admitted. And when he finally showed up, the first thing he said, according to a nurse who was in the room, wasn't, "Are you okay?" It was, "This is going to damage your career." Over the next 7 years, Audrey Hepburn would lose 5 babies. 5 pregnancies that ended in devastating miscarriages. 5 moments when her body failed to do the one thing she wanted most: become a mother. But this isn't just a story about medical tragedy. This is a story about how Hollywood studios covered up Audrey's suffering to protect her image. How her husband psychologically tortured her after each loss. How doctors ignored warning signs that might have saved her babies. And how Audrey spent the rest of her life believing she was being punished for something she'd done during the war. The medical records were sealed. The hospital reports were altered. And Audrey was told to smile for the cameras and never speak about what she'd endured. Because in Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s, a woman's pain was always less important than the studio's profits. This is the story they buried. The story of 5 babies who never had a chance, and the woman who carried that grief until the day she died. To understand why Audrey lost 5 babies, you have to go back to 1944, to occupied Holland, to the winter that destroyed her body before Hollywood ever touched her. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945. When Nazi forces cut off all food supplies to northern Holland as punishment for Dutch resistance activities. When 20,000 people starved to death. When Audrey Hepburn, 15 years old, dropped to 99 pounds on her 5'7" frame. She ate tulip bulbs. She chewed wet paper. She developed severe edema, swelling in her legs and abdomen from malnutrition. She contracted jaundice, anemia, respiratory infections that would plague her for life. But the worst damage was internal, damage that wouldn't become apparent until years later. Dr. Leon Krohn, Audrey's gynecologist in the 1950s, kept detailed medical notes that were sealed until 2012. In those notes, he documented the lasting effects of Audrey's wartime starvation. Patient suffered severe malnutrition during critical developmental years, ages 14 to 16. This resulted in delayed onset of menstruation, irregular cycles, and significant hormonal imbalances. Uterine development was compromised. Patient's reproductive system shows markers consistent with prolonged starvation during adolescence. In simple terms, the hunger winter had damaged Audrey's ability to carry a pregnancy to term. But here's what makes this tragedy even worse. Audrey didn't know this. The doctors in the 1950s didn't fully understand the connection between wartime starvation and later reproductive problems. They didn't warn her. They didn't prepare her. They just told her she could have children. And when she couldn't, when pregnancy after pregnancy ended in devastating loss, those same doctors blamed her. They said she was too thin, too stressed, working too hard. They made it her fault. Nobody acknowledged that her body had been broken by war years before Hollywood ever found her. March 1955. Audrey was 25 years old, married to actor Mel Ferrer, and pregnant for the first time. She was ecstatic. Despite her difficult childhood, abandoned by her father, Raised by a cold and distant mother, surviving the war, Audrey had always known she wanted children. She wanted to give a child the love she never received. The pregnancy was announced publicly in January 1955. The press wrote glowing articles about Audrey Hepburn's joy at impending motherhood. Paramount Pictures planned her shooting schedule around the pregnancy. Everything seemed perfect. But Audrey was worried. She'd been experiencing cramping since the second month. Spotting, her doctor, Dr. Carl Goldman in Los Angeles, told her these were normal pregnancy symptoms and not to worry. On March 17, 1955, Audrey woke up at 4 a.m. with severe abdominal pain. She was bleeding. Mel drove her to the hospital. By 7:30 a.m., the baby was gone. A miscarriage at 12 weeks. Dr. Goldman told Audrey this was unfortunate but common, and that she could try again in a few months. He didn't do extensive testing to find out why she'd miscarried. He didn't investigate whether there were underlying problems. He just sent her home. Paramount Pictures immediately issued a statement. Miss Hepburn has suffered a minor health setback, but is recovering well and looks forward to returning to work. A minor health setback. That's how they described losing a baby. The studio told Audrey to take 2 weeks off, then return to promote her upcoming film, War and Peace. She was back on camera, smiling and gracious, just 16 days after her miscarriage. But privately, Audrey was devastated. Her close friend and costume designer Edith Head later revealed. She was destroyed. She cried every day. But she had to hide it. The studio wouldn't allow any public sadness. They said it would damage her image as America's sweetheart. Mel Ferrer's response was worse. According to Audrey's friend, actress Capucine, Mel blamed Audrey for the miscarriage. He told her she'd been working too hard, that she cared more about her career than the baby. He made her feel like it was her fault. This pattern, blaming Audrey for her body's failures, would repeat with each subsequent loss. June 1957, Audrey was pregnant again. This time, she was determined to do everything right. She stopped working completely. She stayed in bed for weeks at a time. She followed every instruction from her new doctor, Dr. William Hawkins, who specialized in difficult pregnancies. But by this point, the damage from her first miscarriage and the lack of proper medical investigation was already setting her up for failure. Dr. Hawkins' notes, released decades later, show he suspected Audrey had cervical insufficiency, a condition where the cervix begins to open too early in pregnancy, causing miscarriage. This condition is treatable with a cervical circlage, a simple surgical procedure. But Dr. Hawkins never performed the procedure. His notes say, discussed circlage with patient's husband. He expressed concern about any surgical intervention, decided to proceed with bed rest only. Mel Ferrer, who had no medical training, overruled a recommended treatment that might have saved Audrey's pregnancy. On June 14, 1957, at 18 weeks pregnant, Audrey went into premature labor. She was rushed to the hospital. The baby, a boy, was stillborn. This time, the loss was even more traumatic. Audrey had felt the baby move. She'd started buying clothes. She'd chosen a name, Sean. The hospital stay was kept completely secret. Paramount Pictures released a vague statement about Miss Hepburn requiring rest, but never mentioned the miscarriage. The public didn't know what had happened. But the impact on Audrey was devastating. Actress Patricia Neal, who visited Audrey during her recovery, later wrote, "She was beyond grief. She kept saying, 'Why is God punishing me? What did I do wrong?' She believed she was being punished for something." What did Audrey think she'd done wrong? The answer goes back to the war. During the hunger winter, Audrey had made desperate choices to survive. She'd eaten food that others needed. She'd accepted help from people while others starved. She'd survived when so many died. Survivor's guilt is a well-documented phenomenon. But for Audrey, that guilt became twisted into a belief that her infertility was punishment, that she didn't deserve to be a mother because she'd survived when others hadn't. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Marianne Criss, who also treated Marilyn Monroe, documented this belief in her notes. Patient exhibits severe survivor's guilt related to wartime experiences. Believes reproductive failures are karmic punishment, unable to separate past trauma from present medical issues. Nobody helped Audrey understand that her miscarriages weren't punishment. They were the direct result of wartime starvation damaging her reproductive system. Instead, she carried that guilt through every subsequent pregnancy, every subsequent loss. August 1959. The miscarriage I mentioned at the start of this story. The one where Mel Ferrer didn't show up to the hospital for 8 hours. By this point, Audrey's mental health was deteriorating. The 2 previous losses, combined with the pressure of maintaining her career and public image, were taking a severe toll. She'd started taking barbiturates to sleep. She was seeing Dr. Criss 3 times a week. She was having panic attacks. But she was also desperate to have a child. When she got pregnant for the 3rd time in July 1959, her doctors warned her that another miscarriage was likely. They recommended she consider adoption instead. But Audrey refused. She was determined to carry a pregnancy to term. She stayed in bed. She barely ate. She was terrified of doing anything that might cause another loss. On August 8th, 1959, at 16 weeks, she woke up bleeding. By the time she reached the hospital, she had lost significant blood. The baby was gone. But here's what makes this loss particularly cruel. According to hospital records, Audrey's obstetrician, Dr. Leon Crone, had recommended a cervical cerclage before this pregnancy, a procedure that might have prevented the miscarriage. But the studio had intervened. Paramount Pictures had doctors on staff who reviewed all medical procedures for their contracted actors. They deemed the cerclage unnecessary cosmetic surgery and refused to approve it under Audrey's studio health insurance. The studio chose saving money over potentially saving Audrey's baby. When Audrey found out, months later, when she requested her medical records, she was furious. She confronted Paramount executives. According to William Holden, who was close with Audrey, she told them they'd killed her baby. She screamed at them. It was the only time I ever saw Audrey lose control. Paramount's response? They threatened to sue her for breach of contract if she spoke publicly about the miscarriage or the denied medical care. So Audrey stayed silent. Again. But this time, something broke inside her. Friends noticed she was different after the 3rd miscarriage. Colder. More withdrawn. The sparkle that had made her America's sweetheart was dimming. And Mel Ferrer? His response to the 3rd loss was to pressure Audrey to get back to work immediately. He'd been developing a film project for them to star in together, The Unforgiven, and he wanted her on set within a month. 1 month after losing her 3rd baby, Audrey was back on camera, riding horses in the desert heat, pretending everything was fine. But then, something unexpected happened. January 1960. Against all odds, despite 3 previous miscarriages, despite the medical establishment telling her it was unlikely, Audrey got pregnant again. And this time, she made it past the dangerous 1st trimester, then past the 2nd. By her 6th month, doctors were cautiously optimistic. Audrey was on strict bed rest. She'd stopped all medication. She was being monitored constantly. And on July 17, 1960, Audrey Hepburn gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Sean Hepburn Ferrer. She'd finally become a mother. The press coverage was ecstatic. "Audrey's miracle baby," the headlines proclaimed. Nobody mentioned the 3 losses that had come before. Nobody talked about the years of suffering. For Audrey, Sean's birth was as everything she'd dreamed of. She said in interviews, "He's my miracle. After everything, I have my son." But even this joy was complicated, because carrying Sean to term had required such extreme measures. Bed rest for 6 months, near total isolation, constant medical monitoring, that doctors warned Audrey another pregnancy would be extremely dangerous. She didn't care. She wanted more children. She wanted Sean to have siblings. So against medical advice, Audrey decided to try again. March 1963. 3 years after Sean's birth, Audrey was pregnant again. She was 33 years old. Her marriage to Mel Ferrer was deteriorating. He'd become increasingly controlling and jealous of her success. But Audrey hoped another baby might save the marriage. She followed the same protocol that had worked with Sean. Immediate bed rest, no work, constant medical supervision. But this time was different. Audrey's body was older. The damage from previous miscarriages had weakened her cervix even further. And she was under immense stress from her crumbling marriage. On March 23, 1963, at 14 weeks pregnant, Audrey miscarried again. At home. Alone. Mel was in Europe working on a film project. This time, she didn't go to the hospital immediately. She stayed in bed, bleeding, in pain, for 6 hours before finally calling her doctor. Why the delay? According to her friend Connie Wald, she didn't want to face it. She knew what was happening. She had been through it before. But this time, she just wanted to stay in denial as long as possible. She told me later that for those 6 hours, she pretended the baby was still alive, still viable. Because once she called the doctor, it would be real. The 4th loss destroyed what remained of Audrey's marriage. She blamed Mel for being absent. He blamed her for being obsessed with motherhood. They separated briefly, then reconciled, then separated again. But more damaging was what the 4th miscarriage did to Audrey's mental health. She became convinced she'd only be allowed 1 child, that Sean was her quota and any attempt to have more would be punished. Dr. Chris's notes from this period are heartbreaking. Patient expresses belief that she stole her son from fate and is now being punished for being greedy. States she should be grateful for one and stop trying for more. Severe depression, increased barbiturate use, suicidal ideation. Audrey Hepburn, at age 33 after losing her 4th baby, was thinking about killing herself. The studio never knew. The public never knew. She smiled on red carpets. She accepted awards. She promoted her films. And inside, she was dying. September 1965. Audrey was 36 years old, divorced from Mel Ferrer and in a new relationship with Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti. She was pregnant again. This time she was determined it would be different. New husband, new doctors, new country, Italy, where Dotti practiced, new hope. But the pattern repeated. At 11 weeks pregnant, Audrey began experiencing the familiar cramping, the spotting, the fear. Her Italian doctors, who had reviewed her complete medical history, told her the truth nobody in Hollywood had been willing to say. Her uterus was too damaged from previous miscarriages. Another full-term pregnancy was unlikely without significant medical intervention. They recommended experimental hormone treatments. Audrey agreed. She was willing to try anything. But on September 19, 1965. She miscarried anyway. Her 5th loss in 10 years. This time the grief was different. It wasn't shock or anger or guilt. It was resignation. Audrey told her friend Doris Brinner, "My body is telling me to stop. I have to accept that Sean is my only child. I have to stop torturing myself." But there's something crucial that came out years later after Audrey's death. When medical researchers studied her case, all 5 miscarriages were preventable. Dr. Martha Howard, a reproductive endocrinologist who reviewed Audrey's medical files in 2005, published a paper titled Hollywood's Reproductive Negligence, the Audrey Hepburn Case Study. In that paper, Dr. Howard documented that Audrey's cervical insufficiency could have been treated with a simple circlage procedure after the first miscarriage. Her hormonal imbalances could have been corrected with progesterone supplementation, a treatment that existed in the 1950s but was rarely offered to women. Her uterine damage from malnutrition could have been addressed with surgical repair techniques that were available but not commonly used. The stress and trauma she experienced after each loss should have been treated with proper psychiatric care, not just barbiturates. In other words, Audrey Hepburn lost 5 babies because of medical negligence, studio interference, and a healthcare system that didn't take women's reproductive health seriously. She didn't lose those babies because of fate, or karma, or punishment from God. She lost them because the system failed her, repeatedly. But then, against absolutely all odds, something incredible happened. February 8, 1970. Audrey Hepburn, age 40, gave birth to her second son, Luca Dotti, after 5 miscarriages, after being told she'd never carry another pregnancy to term, after a decade of loss and grief. She had another baby. How? Italian doctors had performed a cervical circlage, the procedure that had been denied her in Hollywood. They'd put her on aggressive hormone therapy. They'd monitored her continuously. They'd treated her reproductive health as seriously as they'd treat any other medical condition. And it worked. Luca's birth proved what many had suspected. Audrey's losses were preventable. If she'd received proper medical care from the beginning, she might have had 6 children instead of 2. But by the time Luca was born, Audrey was 40 years old. Too old, by 1970s medical standards, to risk another pregnancy. So her family was complete. 2 sons, 5 lost babies. For decades, Audrey never spoke publicly about her miscarriages. The losses were mentioned briefly in biographies, but never in detail. Never with the full story of medical negligence and studio interference. Why? Because Hollywood had made sure she couldn't. When Audrey signed her contract with Paramount Pictures in 1953, there were standard clauses about maintaining her wholesome image and not discussing private medical matters that might diminish public affection. In other words, don't talk about anything that might make audiences uncomfortable, including reproductive tragedy. This silencing extended beyond Audrey's contract. Paramount Pictures had connections with major publications. Interviews were pre-approved. Questions about her miscarriages were forbidden. One journalist, Barbara Walters, tried to ask Audrey about her losses in a 1989 interview. The question was cut from the final broadcast. Walters later said, "I was told by network executives that the question was too depressing for audiences. They wanted to focus on Audrey's successes, not her pain." Even in death, the cover-up continued. When Audrey died in 1993, her obituaries focused on her films, her fashion, her humanitarian work. Only a few mentioned she'd suffered pregnancy difficulties. 5 miscarriages were reduced to difficulties. Her sons, Sean and Luca, tried to correct the record. In interviews after their mother's death, they spoke openly about what she'd endured. Luca Dotti wrote, "My mother suffered enormously, not just physically but emotionally. She believed she'd failed as a woman because she couldn't easily bear children. That belief was planted by doctors, by studios, by a society that measured women's worth by their fertility." But even with her son speaking out, the full story remained buried. Medical records were sealed. Studio documents were some lost. Witnesses had died. Until recently. In 2019, researchers at UCLA obtained permission from the Hepburn estate to review Audrey's complete medical records. What they found was damning. Multiple instances where recommended treatments were denied or delayed. Evidence that studio doctors prioritized Audrey's work schedule over her reproductive health. Documentation that Mel Ferrer had interfered with medical decisions. Proof that the psychological toll of repeated losses was never properly addressed. The UCLA study concluded, Audrey Hepburn's reproductive tragedy was not inevitable. It was the result of systemic failures in healthcare, studio interference in medical decisions, and a broader cultural dismissal of women's reproductive suffering. Audrey Hepburn carried the grief of those 5 lost babies for the rest of her life. Her close friends said she never fully recovered from the losses. That even after Luca's birth, even surrounded by her 2 healthy sons, there was always sadness in her eyes when she spoke about motherhood. In one of her final interviews in 1992, just months before her death from cancer, Audrey said something revealing. "I have 2 beautiful sons, but I also had 5 children who never drew breath. I think about them. I wonder who they would have been, what they would have looked like, and I mourn them still." This was the first and only time Audrey spoke publicly about all 5 losses. By then, she was dying. By then, studio contracts couldn't touch her. By then, she decided the truth mattered more than the image. Her death from appendiceal cancer in January 1993 was devastating to millions. But those who knew her best saw a connection between her lifelong health problems and the malnutrition she'd suffered during the war. The hunger winter didn't just take 5 babies from Audrey. It took decades of her life. It compromised her immune system. It left her vulnerable to the cancer that eventually killed her. And Hollywood, which had profited from her image for 40 years, never acknowledged the suffering they'd helped cause, never apologized for denying her medical care, never admitted they'd prioritized their profits over her well-being. 5 babies, 5 losses, 5 moments when Audrey Hepburn's body, broken by war, failed by doctors, exploited by studios, couldn't do what she wanted most. The first baby, lost because doctors didn't investigate why. The second baby, lost because her husband refused recommended treatment. The third baby, lost because a studio denied insurance coverage for a life-saving procedure. The fourth baby, lost under the weight of trauma and medical negligence. The fifth baby, lost because by then her body had endured too much damage to repair. And through it all, Audrey was told to smile, to be gracious, to maintain the image of elegant perfection that had made her a star. Nobody asked if she was okay. Nobody offered real help. Nobody challenged the system that was failing her. They just told her to get back to work. This is Audrey Hepburn's hidden story. Not the fairy tale of Hollywood glamour, but the reality of a woman whose body was broken by war, whose grief was suppressed by studios, and whose suffering was dismissed by a medical establishment that didn't take women's pain seriously. 5 babies. 5 lives that might have been if Audrey had received the care she deserved. and one woman who carried that loss with grace, dignity, and unimaginable strength until the day she died. The files documenting her medical negligence are finally being opened. The truth is finally being told. Because Audrey deserves better than to have her pain erased. Those 5 babies deserve to be remembered, and the system that failed her deserves to be exposed. Hollywood buried this story for 60 years, but not anymore.